If you're like me, then you get hungry again before you head to bed at night. I know we've already discussed topics like when to eat and how much to eat, but nobody ever specifically talks about one of the most common questions that I get, which is, what can I eat at night before sleep? Usually, this question is crammed between a few other questions like, won't eating at night make me fat? Or, can I really eat before bed? For a long time, it was believed that eating late at night before going to sleep was bad for your health and would automatically make you gain fat. Eat past 8 equals gain weight, right? Well, not quite. You see, there are several things we need to consider when the topic of nighttime eating is brought up, and a few questions come to mind for me. I wanted to know where these recommendations were coming from. Where is the scientific evidence? And how is nighttime eating defined? Does this mean I should be monitoring what time I eat dinner? How does the nighttime meal size and composition influence my health? And of course, are carbs evil? Lucky for me, I had a way to find these answers. And just like that, nighttime feeding has been a major research focus in my lab at Florida State University. The original premise for starting this line of research stemmed from my glory days as a collegiate ice hockey player. I remember reading about the need to stop eating late at night to avoid gaining fat or feeling lousy. Then various TV shows and media experts began to speak up about it too. I mean, everybody just knew that if you were to have great body composition, you should avoid eating late at night, after dinner, at all costs. The trouble was that I always ate before going to bed. I thought it would be good to help my body recover from practice and workouts so that I could become a better player. And just about everybody I knew who had low body fat and good muscle mass would not only eat at all times of the day, but would purposefully eat before bed and drink a protein shake or have some kind of protein before going to sleep. So how could this huge gap exist between the people I knew who ate before bed and still felt great and had excellent body composition and performed well, and the opposite message that many in the media were telling us? Well, the short answer is that many things influence this public health message, and I'll go over them in this lecture. And after this lecture, you'll have a better understanding of nighttime eating and why many people thought it was off limits. You will also learn about eating protein at night, particularly before bed, can potentially impact body composition and overall health. I'm sure you've come across something or someone telling you that nighttime eating is bad and that you should have a set stop time each night for eating. To understand why most people think that eating at night is bad, we need to dive into some research and physiology. An easy place to start would be with your circadian clock, or the circadian timing system. You see, we all have an internal clock that regulates our physiology with our daily behaviors and surrounding environment. So for many of us, our typical circadian clock keeps us awake and active during the daytime hours and less active during the evening and night hours. Our circadian clock adjusts our physiology to coincide with these typical periods of activity and rest throughout the day. Because many of us are less active in the evening and late night hours, our clock is programmed to slow our internal system down at those times too. But does a less active system at night translate to fat gain if you eat at night? As any good scientist might say, the answer is, it depends. Recall that the food consumed essentially has two fates. It is either stored for later use or burned for energy. Since our biological clock slows things down at night, it seems obvious that food we eat at night will more likely be stored rather than burned during this time. So this may be strike one against eating at night. Now remember, we learned that when you eat carbohydrates, for example, the carbs are broken down into smaller components like glucose that enter your blood. In response to the glucose, insulin is secreted from your pancreas to get your glucose into the cells. This effectively lowers your blood glucose back to normal. Here's a potential strike two against eating at night. Research shows that for the same amount of glucose, greater amounts of insulin are required to remove it from the blood during the night as compared to the day. More insulin produced equals more storage at night. If nighttime eating is not done often, there is likely no problem. But if it's repeated over time, chronically high insulin can lead to a desensitization of the insulin receptors and possibly lead to future problems with your glucose control. Research has also shown that the energy costs of digesting and processing your food, that is the thermic effect of food, goes down at night. That means that if you eat the same exact meal for breakfast as you do for dinner, you'll have a lower energy expenditure in the evening. We also know that we do not feel as full when we eat foods towards the later part of the day. So there's a chance we'll eat more food. And one more point about nighttime digestion. It takes longer for food eaten later in the day to be emptied from the stomach and into the intestines during this time. To sum it up, when we eat at night, more insulin is needed, we feel less full so we eat more, and we have a slower digestion and less energy is used to digest and process food. This tells me that our physiology at night favors storage when we eat towards the latter part of the day. This may not be ideal for body composition. Do you see how the message quickly spread to avoid eating in the evening? I sure do. So, based on the information, could nighttime eating be the wrong time to eat? Well, a study with animals surely has us all convinced that this might be the case. If you change the feeding time of mice so that they are fed a high-fat diet during the time when they normally sleep, which in mice this is during the daylight hours, as opposed to when they are normally awake, which is during the night for mice, the mice gained more fat. This looks like there may actually be a wrong time of day to eat, at least for mice. An interesting finding for sure, but I was told never to trust a rat or a mouse. Now, does this hold true for humans? Is there a wrong time of day for people to eat if they want to maintain or lose fat? If you take the time to do a little research on night eating in humans, you'll see that much of the scientific evidence that is cited for why we shouldn't eat at night was based primarily on people who work the night shift in jobs that provide service 24 hours, such as hospitals, and people with night eating syndrome. This is an eating disorder characterized by eating more than half of your daily food intake after dinner, waking up from sleep to eat, and having little appetite for breakfast. Here, the story was pretty clear too. Night shift workers and people with night eating syndrome who ate late at night ended up getting people bigger, fatter, and less healthy. At this point, you might think that the story of don't eat at night seems to be logical, but there are some other things to consider. For example, in addition to late night eating, these individuals also have disturbed or restricted sleep, and we know that the less sleep you get, the greater your chances for overweight and obesity. Now, to mention the obvious response to sleeping less at night, more opportunity to eat, you have more hours in the day when you might eat. And this could obviously lead to trouble if you're trying to achieve your optimal body composition. There's also controversy with what defines nighttime eating. Much of the research on this topic uses different criteria for night eating. Some will say that it's the total calories consumed within a specific time frame. For example, calories consumed between 5 p.m. and midnight. Others will say it is waking up throughout the night to eat. And the typical dinner meal may or may not be included in what is defined as nighttime eating. What is not controversial is the takeaway message, that if you consume the majority of your food in the evening and night hours, as opposed to during the daytime hours, and in excess of your energy needs, then yes, you will likely have some unfavorable changes in your body composition. But let's be realistic here. Many of us eat our food at various intervals throughout the day, and not primarily at one point in the day or another. Also, most people actually sleep during the night and work during the day. So the way that my research group defines nighttime eating, or pre-sleep eating, is simply taking in an additional snack after dinner and before going to bed. It may be just a matter of knowing what our best food choices are if we want to eat at night. We know that large portions are not ideal, but what about low-calorie, nutrient-dense options? What about protein? Like I mentioned earlier, many athletes and bodybuilders typically consume protein before going to bed. But are they reaping any benefits? In this field of performance nutrition and exercise physiology, we think about feeding our bodies all the time. We basically know how to feed ourselves throughout the day and in relation to exercise in order to optimize body composition and health. This is not surprising, as much of the available research is tailored towards this optimization. For very active people, the rationale for consuming protein before bed is the belief that it would keep you anabolic overnight or promote muscle growth and repair. Remember that anabolic means promoting a metabolic environment to stimulate, in this case, muscle building. The idea is that perhaps over the long term, this continual anabolic state could lead to increased muscle recovery and performance. Simply eating protein before bed to keep muscle growth continuing overnight could give you a competitive edge against the competition, or simply allow you to recover better. Before we get into that possibility, let's briefly go over our options for what that before bed protein snack might consist of. We know that whey protein is a very common use supplement, used every day by athletes and gym goers. However, casein protein, which makes up 80% of the protein in milk, has been highlighted as the best to consume before sleep due to its slow release from the stomach. Casein, found in higher concentrations in foods like cottage cheese and Greek yogurt. The theory is that this allows for prolonged anabolism, or at least less muscle breakdown overnight while you're sleeping. It wasn't until 2012 that research-based evidence on the impact of consuming casein protein before bed was available. In some very nice studies, Professor Luc van Loon and his research team in the Netherlands were the first to show us that consuming casein protein before bed increases muscle protein synthesis overnight. Specifically, they compared physically active young men who consumed either 40 grams of casein protein, equaling 160 calories, or a placebo drink, 2.5 hours after a low-body resistance exercise workout, but within 30 minutes of going to bed. It turned out that the group who drank the casein protein had greater overnight muscle protein synthesis compared to drinking no protein. They then completed a similar study in elderly men, showing that casein protein at night before sleep, but this time via nasogastric tubing, so not exactly drinking it, had the exact same outcome, an increase in muscle protein synthesis. These studies demonstrate a few things. 1, we can digest and absorb protein at night. And 2, we can actually increase muscle protein synthesis while sleeping. Until this point, though, the studies had not been long enough to show that the increase in muscle protein synthesis would actually lead to more muscle mass or better body composition. But it certainly looked like it would. So, in a follow-up study from Professor Van Loon's group, they examined whether acute changes in muscle protein synthesis could translate to changes in muscle size and strength with long-term protein intake before bed, combined with resistance training. They had all the research subjects complete resistance exercise for 12 weeks. At the same time, they gave one group a protein and carbohydrate drink made of 28 grams of casein and 15 grams of carbs every night before sleep. The other group got a no-calorie placebo. During the 12-week training, the group consuming the protein and carbohydrate drink appeared to have greater increases in muscle fiber size and maximal strength than the group getting no calories, protein, or carbohydrates before bed. This study was able to show true improvements in body composition when protein was consumed at night during a 12-week resistance exercise program. We must consider that protein intake was not matched, though, between groups. But this does show us that specifically eating protein at night before bed can increase muscle mass in the long term. Now that we know casein protein before bed is beneficial for muscle growth, you might be wondering if there are any other benefits from consuming casein at night. If so, how do these benefits compare to whey protein and even carbohydrates? Fortunately, work from my lab answers a few of these questions. We found that providing casein, whey, or carbohydrates within 30 minutes of going to bed led to greater resting energy expenditure, so burning more calories, in physically active men the next morning, compared to a lower resting energy expenditure when the men were given a placebo the night before bed. We also found that burning fat was better when fit young men drank either a placebo or a casein protein shake compared to when they were given whey protein or carbohydrates. This shows me that the subjects who drank a placebo, which had no calories, and drinking about 150 calories of casein protein, both responded with a nice fat oxidation or fat burning response. A better response than drinking whey protein or carbohydrates. And taken together, this information tells us that if you're an active individual or athlete, consuming something before bed is better than going to bed on an empty stomach if you want to maximize your calorie burning potential. It also suggests that casein may be better than whey, as casein seems to increase muscle growth overnight and may promote greater fat utilization. So, drinking small amounts of protein before bed seem to be beneficial for active people. But what about for overweight and obese people? Remember, the main reason to avoid nighttime eating was because we were told that it would make us store calories rather than burn them, that is, gain fat. But is this the case when you eat specifically after dinner and before sleep, and you only eat a small portion? To answer this, researchers provided small, low-calorie protein and carbohydrate snacks in the form of cereal and milk to overweight and obese people 90 minutes after dinner. This was opposed to the typical high-calorie, high-fat meals these people were used to eating at night. They did this every day for 4 weeks straight. What they found was that the people who were compliant and ate the cereal at night before sleep, which was about 130 calories of food, ended up lowering the total number of calories that they ate all day long on average over the 4-week study. This led them to actually lose body weight in this study. My guess is that just knowing that you are allowed to eat again later on in the evening might stop you from taking bigger servings or going up for seconds at your other meals. Still, this is the only study to see nighttime feeding in a positive light for people who were not active or fit. Well, we wondered what would happen if nighttime snack was a low-calorie protein beverage, 150 to 160 calories, instead of the protein plus carbohydrate cereal snack. Would appetite change? Would body composition improve? Well, were there any health changes that might come up? What about any cardiometabolic issues or benefits associated with consuming protein or other foods before bed? We looked into this and gave one of 3 beverages, casein protein, whey protein, or a carbohydrate drink, to overweight and obese people within 30 minutes of going to bed. We found that the research participants ended up feeling fuller and had less desire to eat the next morning, regardless of what they consumed. Protein or carbs. It didn't matter. There was no difference between them. Our first thought was that this might be beneficial in terms of reducing total calorie intake the next day, similar to the cereal study I just mentioned. But because the study was only one night long and we didn't measure how much food they ate for breakfast, or if they ate less overall as a result of nighttime eating, we don't really know if pre-sleep snacks had any impact on total calorie intake. They simply reported feeling more full and had less desire to eat. And unfortunately, we also found that all groups, regardless of what they consumed, had higher insulin levels the next morning compared to normal. This was not an ideal finding because we know that obesity is already associated with insulin resistance or lowered ability to use insulin that is produced. So we weren't pleased that their insulin levels were higher. Well, what's the obvious solution to this problem? Exercise. You are all well aware that exercise training increases insulin sensitivity. So doesn't it make sense that adding daily exercise over a long period may stop or reverse this acute insulin resistance associated with eating before bed in overweight and obese people? Well, that is exactly what we found. When we carried out nighttime feeding of protein or carbohydrates before bed with our subjects for 4 weeks straight and included 3 days per week of exercise training, insulin levels did not change from baseline. So that solved the problem. Subjects could have their bedtime snack, could feel fuller, an advantage when you're trying to lower calorie intake, and with added exercise, their insulin levels remained stable. We are also able to show that the group consuming the casein beverage felt fuller at the end of the 4 weeks compared to the group consuming whey and carbohydrates. Looks like a possible advantage to casein protein from this study. But you must be wondering if there were any changes in body composition with the addition of exercise. Did the protein groups have a better outcome? Well, we did show slight decreases in body fat and slight increases in lean mass in all groups, while body weight stayed the same. This should ring some bells. There was no change in body weight, but body composition was ever so slightly better. We also noticed that metabolic rate was increased for the protein groups, but decreased for the carbohydrate group. Now, this was not large enough to be considered statistically significant, but the magnitude of change was interesting to us. Because all the groups improved body composition, regardless of what they ate before bed, we know that it was the exercise that was most important in body composition change, and not necessarily the impact of before bed protein on appetite. But the greater message might be that despite having a 150 calorie snack, in this case from protein or a carbohydrate shake, before bed, body composition still improved with exercise training. The women in the study did not gain weight or fat. That's a great thing. What's more, in a different study, we also found improvements in cardiovascular health as a result of exercise and drinking protein before bed in overweight and obese women. So it turns out that there may be some real advantages to these small protein snacks late at night. We also know that increasing protein in your diet is advantageous for body composition over the longer studies. This nighttime addition of protein will help to increase total protein intake in your entire day. One of the many questions that still remains is what actually happens to fat during the overnight period in response to protein before bed. Well, my lab just finished up a study looking at how casein before bed influences overnight lipolysis, or fat breakdown and mobilization in belly fat. Now, this study hasn't been published as of December 2015 when we taped this course, so I can't tell you all the results, but let's just say that we're excited to share our news. What I want you to understand is that the broad statement like don't eat after 7 p.m. is outdated and based upon research that may not even apply to people like you. It turns out that large meals that are very high in calories and eaten late at night don't seem to be tolerated as well as the same meal eaten earlier in the day. But you now know about all of the emerging research that is beginning to tell a clearer story. And the story is that small, protein-type beverages consumed before sleep may have a number of advantages, particularly when paired with dynamic exercise training. Things like improved muscle protein synthesis, increased muscle mass, increased strength, increased metabolism, and reduced desire to eat. There's no need to fear eating at night, but the right choices need to be made to ward off fat gain and weight gain. For now, it looks like casein is the protein of choice for pre-sleep consumption in active individuals. And not that much, only 150 calories. So try this. If you're hungry at night before sleep, try having a small protein beverage or protein food.